Hello, YouTube maniacs. I am Sean Stoger, and this is Crazy Native Philosophy. This is definitely going to rank up there as one of my all-time favorites because today I'm talking about one of my teachers. This video is called My Mentor, Little Eagle. So in my very first video, I spoke about one of the key factors in my making this channel was my finding a Wallace Black Elk video on YouTube. And I felt very fortunate that I found that video because I managed to meet Wallace twice in my life, and I learned from him. It was only a brief period of time, but when I found that video, it felt like I was able to learn from him again, even though he had passed on. So I imagined some kid in the future, as I was watching that video, I imagined some kid in the future finding one of my videos and being thankful that I took the time to do this as well. So, like I said, I didn't really get that much time with Wallace, but the time that I did get was very profound, and it made a very lasting impression upon me. So this is that story. So after my first enlistment in the United States Army, I went straight into college at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I was a severely messed up kid. I had post-traumatic stress disorder. I had some massive rage issues. I was pretty much a functional alcoholic for about 4 years. I had identity issues, which most people have at that age. But then I also had the separation issues that most veterans have when they leave military service and they're stranded on planet civilian. So luckily, two Ho-Chunk men found me and picked me up off the ground and started mentoring me and taking me to ceremonies. So I became so wrapped up in Native culture that I would say I bordered on obsessive sometimes. During that time, I read every book on every Lakota medicine man that I could find because I'm of Lakota and German descent. And I was not interested in learning about the ways of other tribes. I was just trying to connect with my own culture. So whenever most people hear about books about medicine men, usually the first book that most people think of is Black Elk Speaks. Now, Nicholas Black Elk was like the Michael Jordan of medicine men. And that book is very poetic and moving. But back then, I wasn't able to understand all the nuance and the meaning that was in there. The guy who wrote it was, I believe, a poet, and so it was written very poetically, I guess, and then also Nick was Nick Black Elk, right? So I have not read any of those books that I read way back then in my 20s. I haven't read those in over 25, almost 30 years, and so I still might not understand a lot of that. But I've been meaning to go back and take a look at those. So I know there were a lot of really cool things to contemplate in Black Elk Speaks, and it brought up a lot of really cool and big philosophical topics. So it's definitely something that I intend to go back and read. But back then, the book that I loved most was called Black Elk, The Sacred Ways of a Lakota by Wallace Black Elk and William S. Lyon. Now, all of the other books that I read were very good, but Wallace's book I thought was great. Nick Black Elk was Oglala Lakota, and Wallace Black Elk was Chichangu Lakota. So those are different branches within the Lakota tribe, right? So even though they have the same last name, they're not, and they're both powerful Wachachawakans or medicine men, they did not share the same family lineage, right? They come from two separate bands. As I said, I didn't read books about other medicine men from other tribes outside of Lakota culture because I really saw no need. I was searching for my own roots and my own identity and my own connection to culture, and I didn't want to get confused or mixed up with other traditions. So there was this one Lakota Wachachawakon who was extremely popular, right? And when I read his book, it was all like I, me, my. And so I really didn't like that at all, right? Even though this guy is revered by so many people, I saw him as this big show pony, strutting around and flexing his ego. And from what I understood, that meant he really didn't have much of a connection to Tunkashala or the Great Spirit. Now, Wallace Black Elk, in his book, he really didn't speak about himself much at all. And he mostly just talked about, the Creator and spirits that helped and helping other people. So I really, really enjoyed his book the most. Well, one day I was on State Street, which is a main thoroughfare in downtown Madison, Wisconsin, and I was getting a pizza on State Street. And while I was waiting, I happened to look down, and there was this brochure, and I picked it up, and I started looking through it, and I saw that Wallace Black Elk was going to be speaking at a conference in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So I borrowed some money from one friend, and I borrowed a car from another friend, and I drove the 4 hours to meet Wallace. And my brain was buzzing with all these questions that I wanted to ask him about all this stuff that I had been learning, right? So I'd been singing on our power drum. I'd been taking all these American Indian Studies classes on campus. I'd been listening to anything that any elder anywhere would teach me about anything. I've been going to sweat lodges almost every single weekend. I've been reading all these tons of first person narratives. And I've been hanging out with all the other Native students on campus. And all of that was awesome. But to me, going to meet Wallace Black Elk was my chance to possibly visit with one of the greatest medicine men on Turtle Island. So if anybody could answer the questions that I had, I figured it would be him, right? So I drove the 4 hours to Minneapolis, and I walked into the conference. And it was like this giant airplane hangar, right, with tables and booths set up everywhere. And as soon as I stepped inside, it was like those old Western movies, and the music just stopped dead as soon as I walked in, right? And everyone was staring at me, right? I was definitely the anomaly in this place. I had long hair like I do now, and I was wearing a flannel shirt and blue jeans and work boots. And the only other guys that stood out were these, Tibetan Buddhist monks that were doing this big sand painting, and they were wearing the big gold and maroon robes, So me and those Buddhist monks must not have gotten the email memo on the dress code for this conference thing, because, everybody else was wearing cardigan sweaters and polo shirts and khaki pants. So I definitely stood out, right? I casually roamed through the mazes of booths and tables, and I saw all these exhibits on crystal healing and astrology and tarot cards and magical enemas and crazy stuff like that. Nothing I was interested in. All I was there to do was find Wallace Black Elk. But I couldn't find him anywhere. So I went outside to smoke a cigarette, right? And I started smoking in the Army, and I finally quit 6 or 7 years later. But as I was smoking, all of a sudden Wallace Black Elk came walking outside and to smoke also. And with them came these two helpers, right? But these two women that came with them, they didn't smoke at all. And they were just busy chatting away, with each other like they were two aunties at bingo, right? But Wallace was extremely observant, really sharp. And in the professional protector career field, we would say that he had an elite level of situational awareness. So I was studying him, and he was studying me, and we are both professionals on the job, right? These two helpers were just oblivious, but Wallace and I were just totally locked in, right? So I took a step forward, and I said, "You're Wallace Black Elk, aren't you?" And he nodded and said yes. And then the two women went silent all of a sudden, and finally they noticed that I existed on the planet. And then I introduced myself in Lakota, and I told them that I was from Madison, and I really loved his book, and I drove 4 hours to hear him talk. So Wallace smiled real big, and we sparked up a light conversation after that, and I told him that I'd like to visit him sometime because I had all these questions that I wanted to ask him, right? And Wallace was a little flustered, and he pulled back about a half step and kind of motioned to one of his helpers, and The helper then told me to, go inside and find this booth, and I said, okay, So, they finished up and they went inside, and a couple minutes later I went inside, and I roamed around some more, and finally I found the booth that they'd mentioned, right? And it helped a lot that Wallace Black Elk happened to be standing right there. So of course, I said something amazingly cool and suave, like, oh, this must be the place, right? And one of his helpers, handed me this clipboard, and it was a sign-up sheet, and on it said sweat lodges, right? And I remember thinking, I really don't need to go into a lodge. I just want to ask some questions. But I kind of shrugged it off and figured, I'm going to add my name to the list with, a bunch of other people that had already signed up. But I figured, whatever it takes to get me close to him, and so I can ask the questions that were just buzzing through my mind, right? So I put the clipboard down, and I didn't want to be a pest, so I meandered around the venue there, and until it was time for Wallace to give his talk. So the room that Wallace Black Elk was presenting in was this huge room, and all of the cardigan sweater people sat way in the front, and the last 3 or 4 rows were completely empty. So I sat way in back alone there, and Wallace Black Elk gave a little prayer, and then he began to talk. And he had like a dry erase board or like an easel or something like that on the side there, and so his helper started to draw this circle there, and he stopped her and said, no, draw it real big so that guy way in the back can see it too. And he meant me, of course. So I busted up laughing, and throughout his talk, Wallace would throw in a bunch of native humor and about things like res cars and res dogs and stuff like that, and none of these khaki pants people would laugh at his jokes, and I was just cracking up. I thought Wallace had an amazing sense of humor, and these people just didn't get it, I guess. And so to the skeptical Westerner, what I'm about to say is probably going to sound like some tree-hugging, kumbaya, too much LSD, hippie, mystical BS, right? But I want to remind you that I am a skeptical person by nature. And I like to say that I'm a philosopher with the mind of a scientist. So what I mean by that is I don't just hop on the mystical hippie bandwagon, right? I need to see stuff and experience stuff for my own. And that being said, I have seen and experienced things that I cannot understand and that defy scientific or rational explanation. And the fact that I can't explain it in modern terms does not negate my own experience. And many times I've been with other people and they see the exact same things I do. So I just chalked it up to something that I can't explain, and I just leave it at that. Now, to me, this is like the fundamental difference between the tribal way and the civilized way. And by civilized, I mean people who live in cities, right? Or the culture that comes from the first cities, right? So civilized people always must know things, right? They must always have an explanation, and they are very uncomfortable with mystery or not knowing. So ultimately, I think this shows itself to be pure ego. And the Western mind is very uncomfortable with the idea of that it cannot know everything. And this is why, scientists today search for a single theory that explains everything in existence. It's based on the egotistical assumption that the human mind can grasp everything, right? Or understand everything. Now, in Lakota and in every tribe that I know of, indigenous people accept that there are things that they will never understand, and that there are things that we as human beings are too limited to grasp, and that there are other beings in the cosmos that are unbelievably smarter and more powerful than us. And in our language, we just simply summarize this as Wakan, right? And so there's no real easy translation for that. But that being said, So when Wallace Black Elk was speaking, over his head in the crease where the ceiling comes up and the wall comes up and it meets the ceiling, like right in that little crease right there, there were these 5 little bright lights that were directly centered over him. And they were these white, bright little lights that were brighter than LED Christmas lights. And the only way I can describe it is they were like 5 little diamonds, but that were brought, instead of reflecting light, they were broadcasting brilliant light outward. But these 5 little lights were like perfectly spaced in between each other, and they were directly centered above him, right? But they were also in that crease and very small in size. So these were not mechanical lights installed for stage lighting. Like, they were not shining down like a spotlight, and I kept wondering if I was the only person who was seeing these, or why no one else was paying any attention to these lights, right? And from my experience in the Iniki Kagapi, or sweat lodges, right? These were spirits, right? So unlike the other ones I had seen, these were much, much brighter and clear, and I want to say pure, but they were also perfectly aligned and centered directly on him. So these were 5 beautiful, strong spirits watching over Wallace Black Elk, and I was awestruck. And what this said to me was, he didn't just have, spirits watching over him. He had 5 badass, locked, cocked, and ready to rock spirits that were strong, tight, disciplined, sharp, clear, and bright. And they were, boom, right there, So after Wallace's talk was over, I left the khaki pants airplane hangar, and I began the 4-hour drive home. And I drove home happy that I got to meet him, and I had that experience. But I was also a little disappointed, right? Because not a single question that I had, or that I came with, had gotten answered. So everything that Wallace talked about in his discussion there was stuff that I already knew. So when I got back home, I called my mom and I told her I was home safe, because of course she wanted to know I was home safe. And so she asked me how it went, and I told her the tale, and she could probably tell I was a little disappointed in my voice there. And so I told her everything Wallace talked about, and that I already knew the stuff that he was saying, and none of my questions were answered. And so my mom said, that maybe the reason you went there was not to learn anything different, but to confirm what you already know. And I was like, my mind was blown, right? But it made me feel so much better, because it did. It validated everything that I had learned up to that point. But I still had this ravenous passion, and I was burning alive with questions. And so for the next year, I kept trying to connect with Wallace Black Elk, and I was having no luck, right? And obviously the list with the sweat lodge stuff on there, that no one reached out to me, and I wasn't expecting that anyway. So, but one day I came across the email address for the guy that co-authored the book with Wallace, named Mr. William S. Lyon. So I told him my story, and Mr. Lyon wrote me back, and he said, "Don't tell him I gave this to you." And he sent me Wallace Black Elk's home address. So a few weeks later, I drove across the country to Denver, and to go visit Wallace Black Elk. So, excuse me. So Wallace lived in this small, dusty house on the edge of Denver, in a very industrial area. And there was like this gas station or service station kind of thing across the street, and there were some industrial plants like kind of all around there. I don't really remember any other houses nearby. I think there may have been one there. But I knocked on his door, and I was a little nervous, and he arrived at the door within just a couple minutes. So he looked at me, and And then I reintroduced myself and I told him, we met in Minneapolis, and then, oh yeah. And then he invited me in, and his place was full of stuff, and so it was obvious that I wasn't the only person in the world to bring Wallace Black Elk a gift, right? So I gave him this star quilt that my mom had given me a couple months prior, and my mom wasn't so happy that I gave away that gift so quick, but she understood, Wallace was very appreciative, and then he set it off to the side, and I told him that I wanted to help him, and I wanted to move to Denver and to help him out, So, he motioned for me to sit down, and he sat down in his recliner, and I think he was watching TV probably before I got there. But from that point on, I maybe said 10 words to Wallace, and when I walked in the door and sat down. But after that, Wallace spoke to me for 8 hours straight, and he talked about like traditional ways and ceremonies and things like that the entire time. And I completely focused all of my attention on him. I mean, everything. I sat like a statue, like I was hypnotized, and I tried to absorb every single thing he said. I just, completely emptied my mind out and just let him pour in there whatever he wanted to. And those 8 hours seemed like it passed in 8 minutes. Like, that's how fast it went. I don't even think I blinked in that time, right? But after those 8 hours were up, Wallace had some place to be. So all of a sudden I kind of snapped out of it, and he was going to dinner at someone's house. So Wallace, started getting ready, and all of a sudden while he's getting ready, he all of a sudden drops his pants, and he's standing there in his boxer shorts. And I was like all flustered and totally awkward, and I felt kind of weird, and then he just put on some new pants, and I was like, okay, and like a deer in the headlights, and I didn't know what to think, and then I started wondering, did that really happen? Did I just see that? Like, but he continued to spruce up a bit, and then he gave me this instant camera. And it's one of those old school ones where you take the photo and then it spits out the photo underneath, and it takes a few minutes, and then the photo appears. So I'm gonna show you that photo right now. Well, he keeps hustling and bustling around and getting ready, and he tells me that he's gonna get a new camera, but he didn't know which one he was gonna get, so he needed my help to decide, right? So he handed me this catalog, and he pointed to these 4 different cameras kind of down at the bottom, and he asked me to, look at the features and kind of tell him which was the best camera, So while I was looking them over and talking about the features, and he buzzed around and finished getting ready some more, and so I just kind of took my best guess, because I didn't really know a lot about cameras back then, but I had this sneaking suspicion like he already knew kind of what camera he was going to pick out. So finally it was time to go, and we go outside, and my pickup truck is gone, So apparently I parked in some kind of loading zone, and my truck got towed. So Wallace took me across the street to the service station there, and they made some phone calls, and my truck was being brought back to me. So when he knew I was okay, Wallace Black Elk left for his dinner plans, and I could tell I was probably making him late, and I deeply apologized, and he was extremely gracious and gave 0 indicators of being late or stressed or anything. And so it was purely my intuition that, that I was making him late. But, it's like I said, that super sharp awareness where we were studying each other. So, at that point we parted ways, and that's the last I ever saw him. So until I saw him on YouTube, right? My truck arrived about an hour later, and then I started the 19-hour drive home to Wisconsin. So some of the things that Wallace talked about in his living room made sense right there as he told me, right? And then some things started to make sense like an hour or two later. So like as I was driving, all of a sudden it dawned on me that I told him that I wanted to help him, right? So what did Wallace Black Elk do? He had me help him pick out a camera, right? So I meant, I wanted to move to Denver and help him run ceremonies and learn from him, but I said, help him, and he had me help him. So it took me 2 hours to kind of figure that one out. So he was absolutely brilliant and clever and crafty like a fox. And over those 19 hours, some more things started making sense. And some of the things Wallace told me about made sense months later, and some things made sense years later, and other things I'm still trying to figure out. So one of those things he talked about took me 27 years to understand. And finally, this past fall, I just figured it out. And when I did, it was the key to a door to a much bigger puzzle. And so you're probably wondering what that puzzle is, right? So Wallace Black Elk told me a circle, a square, and a triangle are the same. And that's it, right? Now, when medicine men say something like this, they don't say it for no reason, right? And unlike, Western society, they're not going to sit there and explain it to you or give you the answer. It's up to the student to figure that out, if you figure that out. So that puzzle, if you want to call it a puzzle, or riddle, or whatever you want to call that, it took me 27 years. And I'll say, I don't think you can figure that out without knowing quite a bit about Lakota culture and philosophy. And maybe you can, I just don't know, but maybe you can. However, in the true spirit of Wallace Black Elk, or Little Eagle, I learned a little bit more about this puzzle, this 27-year-old puzzle, that I think he would absolutely love, and that I will share with you. So about a month or 2 months ago, I was watching my favorite television show for the 5th time all the way through, and that's The Big Bang Theory. And one of the main characters, his name is Dr. Sheldon Cooper. He's just kind of this odd duck, socially awkward guy. He's this theoretical physicist. And he solved Wallace's puzzle in season 11 of the show. And he noted that a circle, a triangle, and a square all combine into one perfect form in the universe. And that is a delivered pizza. So I think Juan Bleach-Estilla or Wallace Black Elk, Little Eagle would love that one. So Wallace was a World War II combat veteran, and like all great ceremony leaders, I would describe him as a human hug. He was always warm and comforting and easygoing and natural and human, very human. And unlike many ceremony leaders, he had a wicked sense of humor, right? Like above and beyond. Like most guys have a good sense of humor. His was phenomenal. So Wallace was also really good friends with Stephen Hawking, who also appears in Big Bang Theory many times, right? Stephen Hawking was called the world's smartest man when he was alive. And 10 seconds around Wallace Black Elk, and you knew why he and Stephen Hawking were great buddies, right? Wallace was absolutely brilliant. So I think Wallace would have loved Big Bang Theory, and I think he would love Sheldon Cooper's solution to his puzzle if he had heard it. So now every ceremony leader or medicine man that I've met since then doesn't even come close to Wallace Black Elk. He is like on a different planet, right? Now my mentors, Rick Cliff and Robert Lujan, they do come the closest. But Wallace was still light years beyond anyone else. And my time with him was so limited, but it was profound. And I continuously hope that, that I become the kind of man that he saw in me that day in his living room, and I strive to be worthy of everything that he taught me. So my mentor, Rick Cliff, later told me, he said, well, you know why he dropped his pants, right? And I was like, no, like not a clue. And he said what he's trying to tell you is you're too serious. So that's something I was told a lot when I was younger, before I allowed myself to go crazy. Wallace was, definitely one of the best jokers out there. And so I think he was trying to tell me to lighten up and have some more fun. So I know it's not good to compare people or compare ceremony leaders like that, but this is the only way that I could express what it was like to be around him. Like he was just so different. Wamblichistilla or Wallace Black Elk served the cosmos as a medicine man for the vast majority of his 83 years with us. And he always said that he was no medicine man. So our world loses so much when men like this make that journey, or people like that make that journey. And I am forever grateful for the little time that I got in this life to be with him. I hope to honor him by helping others as best as I can and by passing on what he passed to me. So hopefully in doing so, we can all work together to build a brighter tomorrow for the generations that follow us. Mataki.